Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining the Emotional Abuse Recovery Podcast. Today, I have a really special guest, and I think you're going to really enjoy this topic. We have a lot of wonderful things to talk about, and I'm going to let you go ahead and introduce yourself, Nanci, and tell everybody who you are.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Allison, so much for this. I am Nanci Reed, and I am a Pilates Intuitive Healer, a spiritual life coach, and a student teacher of A Course in Miracles, and a recent new author as well.
Wow. So we're going to have to talk about all these different things. This is amazing and quite a lot of cool stuff that you do. So Pilates Intuitive Healer. Can't wait to hear about that. Spiritual life coach. I think a lot of people understand what that is, but I'll have you go into that. And then a student of A Course in Miracles. And then
and a teacher. Yeah.
A teacher. Okay. And then the last one is that you're an author too, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. So where should we start? You tell me.
Okay. Let's start with Pilates, because I feel like that is kind of the very beginning of all of this.
Okay. Yeah. Tell us how you got into that and what's the story and the background about that.
Okay, so Pilates basically found me after I found myself falling off of a cliff as a passenger in a car accident, and literally thought that I was going to die.
Wow.
And had that moment, like people talk about, where I didn't see like my whole life flash before me, but what I did see was really interesting and kind of started all of this was that I saw every moment of any relationship that I still had not healed, basically. So if there was any kind of resentment, if there was unforgiveness, and I actually saw each of those experiences. It was really fascinating. And I was like, why am I being shown this before I'm going to die? Because I was so certain. And then I heard this voice inside of myself, the same voice that told me not to get into that car, by the way, which I definitely mute because he was cute and I wanted to impress him, and he was going to take me on this drive, and I didn't know that he'd been drinking. And so there's a whole other story behind that as well, about trusting your inner voice, but I wasn't quite there yet. And so I, had muted that voice. But as soon as I saw that literally this was going to be the last thing I was going to see were these unhealed relationships, I asked for help. And within myself, I heard my own voice say, push up. And so I felt this just like force basically in my right hand, where I pushed it as hard as I could up on the roof of the car. And when I did that, it actually kept me from hitting the dashboard and potentially being much more seriously injured than I ended up being. So even though I ended up separating my AC joint in my right shoulder because of that pushing, all that force, and twisting my whole thoracic spine, which wasn't so great, it could have been much worse. And so when we actually stopped at the bottom of this cliff, and I had the windows down on the car, I still can remember like the smells. And I know people talk about that when they have traumatic experiences, that it's like time stops. And so for me, I do every single detail of that experience. And yet it was probably only just a couple minutes at the most. And so there was like dirt that was literally coming in the window on top of me. And I had this moment where when I finally kind of, realized that we were stopped, that I thought I was dead. And so I, was just like, okay, so is this it? And what was that for? Why was I being shown all of those experiences where there was that resentment and that unkindness, basically. And then I had this other feeling where I was like, I got to get out of here. And, I didn't even bother checking with the other person in the car with me. I was just like, I have to get out of here because, dead or not, I wasn't going to stay in this car and in this position. And so I, crawled out the window, and I realized that it was kind of getting to be dusk. And so, cell phone didn't have any reception in the middle of nowhere. And it was getting darker and darker. And all I thought of doing was climb up in the dark. So I started climbing. And I still remember I was wearing these like, soccer shorts kind of thing, like just athletic wear. And then I had this like, Gap hoodie on, and it was like a pale color. And so I was climbing up this hill, and I was grabbing on to the thing, came to find out later were poison oak, actually. So I ended up getting on top of everything else. This poison oak, it's systemic infection. So kind of crazy. But I was climbing up. And then I saw these headlights coming around the bend. And I realized that there was a car that was coming. And it looked like a really big car. I mean, I couldn't even tell, but it was just like these huge headlights. And I could make out that it was kind of like this white vehicle of some kind with these big headlights. And then all of a sudden the car stopped. And I heard this voice. And it said, like, is someone there? Like, do you need help? Like, we're here, or something like that. And I was like, yes, we're here. And, the car went off the edge, and could you please help me? But I'm still holding on to, like, the edge basically of this cliff, like grabbing onto these like branches and anything I could to keep myself from falling back down. And so this guy all of a sudden appears like in my vision, and he's just like kind of this burly looking kind of like handyman, type guy. And he was like, he's like, well, you've got to let go, because I can't lift you up to the road from this angle. And I was like, I can't let go, I'm gonna fall. And I didn't think I could have this to come back up again, even though I was just operating on adrenaline at that point. And I was so afraid of what lay below. And I thought maybe the car would blow up and all these other things. And so I'll never forget the words he said, where he said, I've got you, baby girl. Sometimes in life you need to let go in order to be saved. And so I was just like, okay. So I took this deep breath, and I reached up with all of my strength, and I met his hand. And then he lifted me. He was that strong, like off the side up onto the road next to him. And then he helped my date as well, and got him up because he was way behind me, but he was coming up, and he was fine, of course, because he was relaxed.
Right.
So that was the very beginning of kind of this experience of hearing that voice, seeing this idea of unkindness, unforgiveness, and having there be some kind of purpose behind that. So then flash forward, I ended up with this AC joint separation. I was completely covered in poison oak from head to toe. And I was super, super, super uncomfortable and in pain all the time. And so I had this feeling of, well, what can I do right now? I can't control anything. I can't control my body. I almost felt like I actually hadn't up from the bottom of that cliff, like that I was still down there, because in a way that would be simpler and that would make more sense. So I remember, like, I would go around the house. I was living with my aunt and uncle at the time, and I would put my hand over like a candle because I wanted to feel something, because I just felt numb, even though I was in pain. It was such a weird combination of things. And I was having nightmares and recurring dreams and everything. And so, basically one of these days when I couldn't sleep, and I'd had this dream where the faces of the driver kept changing. And so, it was different people from my life that I'd given away my power to, basically. And then the driver was me. So I thought that was really interesting. And so as I was going through all of that, and I was so scared and so just, in pain and not sure what to do with this physical pain, and then this emotional pain, and really the spiritual pain too, was I thought, well, why don't I just take out this journal that my aunt had given me and start writing? So I started to write. And what I noticed was that as I was writing, I felt calmer. And while I was writing, I felt like I was like remembering rather than writing something new. And so I was like tapping into something. And then when I finished, I looked down and I was like, wow, this is really like interesting, because it didn't really seem like my style of writing or anything, even though it was coming from me. And yet I felt so much better. So I kept on, writing and writing and writing, but then I still had this shoulder pain that was happen anytime I wasn't writing. So it was like, what am I going to do? So I went to see all these different specialists, and a friend of mine finally had told me that, maybe you want to try something called Pilates. And I was like, what is this Pilates? I think I'd seen something like in People magazine or something where these celebrities had done Pilates, and that it was this expensive, kind of like thing basically. And it had these weird contraptions and machines and everything. And she's like, yeah, but it also is really helpful for rehab and for rehabilitation. And I'd been told by a shoulder surgeon that I reminded him of his wife, who was this ballerina. And he said, with her, what I recognized was that all of her injuries that she'd had, I guess, from something similar, was that they weren't going to stay, they wouldn't help, the surgery wouldn't help them because she had this internal laxity in her ligaments that I just happened to too. So on top of everything else, I was hypermobile. I was finding out. So where somebody else's shoulder would have actually dislocated, mine just separated. But the separation left this like laxity in the ligaments that even if they did the surgery, he thought it would just stretch back out again. I would be in pain. So he said, rather than try to do the quick fix, I think you need something where you're going to get strong from the inside. And he's like, I don't really know what that is, but, you know, I bet it's out there. So, you know, you seem like a smart girl. Go see if you can find something, basically. And so he didn't want to do the surgery and he forwarded me on. And so I went to physical therapy at first, which did help in the short term. But as soon as my insurance gave out, then I was back at ground zero again. And I didn't have all they did was focus on the affected side, not like the whole body. So then I remembered my friend's conversation about Pilates and I thought, well, what the heck? So I just remember I literally went to Yahoo at the time, I think, and I looked up like Pilates studios near me. And I found one that was like in the A's of the alphabet. So it was like at the very top of the list. And I called her and I just, you know, I said, hey, this is my, you know, story. I've heard that Pilates can be really helpful for this. Is this the kind of thing you do? And she's like, oh, actually, that's my specialty. I work with rehab. And so, yeah, come on in. And so I went, and it was like from day one, what was really fascinating to me about Pilates was that we didn't focus on my injury. She told me my shoulder was going to be the effect of getting everything else back into alignment and getting me stronger from the inside out, just like the surgeon had suggested. And then the shoulder would be something we would work on, but on its own, it would kind of just come along for the ride. And that she was hoping that the pain would, you know, start dissipating more and more and more. And so, true to her word, about like, you know, a month or so into the sessions, what I noticed was I wasn't in as much pain. And we hadn't done anything directly with the shoulder.
You know, I think that's really interesting because it's sort of like that holistic approach. And when it comes to healing, that happens a lot too. Like even with, you know, in your case, physical, but with also emotional, you know, you can't just focus on one area. A lot of times, if you're doing a lot of different things like journaling or meditating or doing breath work and physical activity and yoga and like eating well, like all of that stuff really affects every single part of your body. So I think that's really interesting too, that someone that was helping you was even saying, okay, here's your area that's not healed, but we're actually not going to like put all of our attention there. We're going to like focus on everything else and like watch it unfold. And it did.
Yeah, it was almost like we didn't put pressure on the shoulder to have to be any different than what it's allowed to be at that moment. You know, we didn't judge it. Yeah. So that we allowed the shoulder to be where it was. And at that point, it was really frightened. And, you know, it didn't feel like it could support. It didn't feel like it could have any kind of burden put on it, right? Literally.
Yeah.
And
love that. That is amazing.
And so that was my introduction to Pilates. And I'm so grateful to have found, you know, one of my really early teachers that way, because her philosophy then really allowed me to see what was possible from Pilates from this different perspective. You know, there's other teachers out there and, you know, everyone teaches their own way, but I was just really, really fortunate that this teacher was also able to meet me exactly where I was without judgment, and that she was able to empower me to recognize that everything that was happening in my shoulder was actually a part of this story bigger, which is my body, about having this hypermobility, about having a scoliosis, about having, which was made worse by the car parks, you know, by having these other experiences, riding horses as a kid, getting bucked up, having a horse roll, and all these things that happened in my body that I didn't really realize actually were kind of part of my body's story. And so she let me tell her everything that had happened. And then we just went through the body and basically we balanced it, but we balanced it in a way that didn't deny anything that had happened from the past. But we also then invited it to be at its most aligned present too. and then the shoulder just came along.
That is so cool. And I love that you had that foundation, right? Like you started, it's amazing how the world works like that. And the universe just puts you on the right path where you're supposed to be, but that you have this foundation that you can physically really connect with and understand how it works. I'm curious to know how that turned into, well, maybe not turned into, but migrated into other areas of your life as maybe as like a spiritual coach and teachers of these Course in Miracles. Like how does that foundation spread into other areas of your life?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the way that the foundation, I think, would spread is that from that one moment where I saw all those moments of resentment and unforgiveness, kindness became something that was really important to me. And so after the accident and I began to heal physically, I, also was looking at the emotional side and the spiritual side because I recognized that I had experienced something that was beyond time and space when I had that sense of putting my hand up, when I heard that voice, when I saw what I saw. And then I knew that there must have been a part of me that was willing to look at that and had asked to see that too, that it wasn't just by random chance. And so that there was this part within me. And I was beginning to really, really look at the idea that you didn't have to necessarily suffer in order to have these transformations, in order to have these awakenings, but that suffering sometimes can bring us to a greater sense of willingness. And, like at that point, I was willing to paint myself purple if it meant that I didn't have to hurt as much, if it meant that I didn't have to, have the dreams that I was having. I mean, I would have tried just about anything. So I think that that's a great place for people to come to, is that it's never about the specific form. It's about what form is going to meet where you are in a way that aligns with who and what you really are. And that it's going to then, so someone else can tell you a story about what worked for them. And that's fantastic. And it can be inspiring, but it shouldn't be that point that then you have comparison, right? So that like you're using it then as an example of that, oh, well, I'm not healing as fast as them because, they must have been better than me, or they must have had some kind of letter after their name that I'm missing. There's always that sense that we're not enough and that's why we're not healing. And so what I really loved about this experience with Pilates and then with my experience with coaching is that it's about, instead of saying that this is the ideal and we're just going to get you there, however it is, it's about saying you are the ideal of yourself. And, there may or may not be like a costume basically on you right now that is the part that needs to be healed. But that underneath of you is the wholeness. Underneath of you is within you. And that you don't need to let anyone else define what's possible for you. Mm-hmm. That you can use them as inspirations. You can draw upon stories, but watch your mind wanting to go into a place of comparison, shame, or blame in order to keep you stuck. Yeah. And that, if you can watch that with that same idea of kindness, and I always say curiosity too, rather than judgment, you make space then for those experiences that look like serendipity, that look like those 1 in a million miracles, right? Mm-hmm. To happen. But it's because you actually made a decision. And you made a decision to allow there to be space. You made a decision to make space for the quote, how, rather than getting stuck on that there's only one specific way or one specific how. And if you don't measure up, then somehow you're not enough.
Right. So instead of, leading with judgment, because obviously we don't heal when we're judging ourselves, because then there's a lot of shame or guilt or other emotions, and we can't experience true healing when we're constantly judging. So I love how you talk about being curious instead, right? Because if we can just look at ourselves from a curiosity standpoint instead of critical eye or judgmental or something like that, it, like you said, it opens up more possibilities for us, because if we're not looking at ourselves that way, we're boxing ourselves in, and there might be other things out there that align with us that we haven't considered, we haven't thought of, other ways of thinking, other ways of acting. So I love that. And I'm really really interested because you brought this up a couple of times, this kindness thing. Like, I want to know more about that. It sounds like it's a really high value for you, and it is for me too. It's one of my top 3 values. So tell me a little bit about that moment when you had this thought about the unkindness and the unforgiveness, but mostly the unkindness. Like, what was that about? And like, how has that been a big part of what you do?
What I recognized was that it was so much about learning how to be kind. Because, I mean, let's face it, all you have to do is look at a young child and what they're born with, that innate sense of gentleness, that innate sense of curiosity. And so they have the kindness. So what happens with life, right? Life teaches us how to be unkind. Life teaches us how to hold on to resentments. Life teaches us how to be afraid of forgiveness, because somehow there's going to be some kind of weakness perceived in that. And so for me, what I came to know was that it was about undoing the unkindness, but that I needed to be willing to look at those decisions to be unkind, but without unkindness. So instead, I needed to bring kindness with me as I looked at any decisions to be unkind, and that would actually be the healing. And so for me, what that looked like after the accident was that any of those experiences that I had seen, where there had been that resentment, where there had been that unhealing, I made it kind of a mission to go through them in my mind, and either physically, if I could, or if not, then just emotionally, spiritually, however you would say it, offer my part in that situation with full accountability, without guilt, like that I'm a bad person, quote unquote, but that I took accountability for my part in it. And so remember, there was, one of my really good friends that I hadn't been able to make it to her wedding. That's what I had said, right? And at the time, it was because I was having like flashbacks basically from a really abusive relationship that I had been in. And there was the sense of not feeling safe. And so the thought of getting onto an airplane by myself, because it wasn't a +1, right? It was just me. And so I was going to get on an airplane and go by myself and not know anybody and have all this social anxiety. And I was still, having all these other traumas like from before, basically, was overwhelming. But I couldn't say that to her. So instead, I just said, oh, my job won't let me leave or something. It was like some just ridiculous excuse that clearly was threadbare. And she saw right through it, and so she was hurt. Mm-hmm. And so I recognized that was my part in it. And so, I reached out to her, and I remember I sent her an email, and I said, I was in this really bad car accident, and I had this vision, and I saw our friendship, and I saw my part in not being honest with you for our friendship and your wedding and everything. And I feel terrible about what happened, and I miss you, and I love you. And I wanted you to know that, you don't owe me anything. If you're not, basically there's no pressure on you for this, but I fully own what I did, and that I'm not trying to justify any part of it, but at least let me tell you that I'm aware of it, and that it was one of the last thoughts that I thought I was having in this body, basically. Yeah. So it was that important to me. So I wrote it to her, and then I remember I didn't hear anything back, and I was like, oh, okay. Okay, I guess I did have an expectation, even though I was doing my best not to have one, and just to be, clear and present about it. But then, like probably 3-4 days later, I'm at my office. And all of a sudden, I had this office. It was kind of like a fishbowl, they called it, because I could like look out into the hallway through this like glass door, and so there was like a common hallway, and I heard these footsteps, and I'm like, that's weird, because it was mostly men in my office, and so I didn't really hear like kind of lighter footsteps very often. They were more kind of like elephant clods, mm-hmm. And all of a sudden it was a lighter footstep, and I just looked up, and there's my friend. And she's like, I read your letter, and I just was sobbing, realizing that if I hadn't been able to see you one more time, to have this moment, of forgiveness, mm-hmm. that I just wouldn't have been able to live with myself, from that point. And she's like, I realized how much I missed you. And she's like, I told, her husband, She said, I'm getting on a plane as soon as I can, basically. And I'm going to go see her. And I'm not going to tell her. She didn't tell anyone. And, she knew where I worked, and she came, and she was. And from that moment, we started over. We didn't even talk about the past. It was like we just were with each other fully and present, and we've still been best friends ever since.
That's a wonderful story. I love it.
You know,
Yeah. And, the part about it I love so much. Well, one, there's two parts. I love that you were able to reconnect with her, but because, everybody loves a good story like that. But the part that really caught my attention was when you said, I owned it, right? Because a lot of times there is this sort of confusion about taking responsibility or taking blame or something like that. But owning your part in any situation or any relationship, it doesn't mean that you have to take blame or, accountability or like anything like that. It's just really ownership is being aware. It's just being aware of who you are, your actions, how they may affect other people, how they may affect you, how you're thinking, what you're saying, how you're behaving, all of that. So that is the key to what actually changed the relationship between the two of you. Because I think that if you had done everything else the same, but didn't have the ownership of that, it probably wouldn't have turned out the same way.
No, I mean, it's possible because as there wouldn't shift,
Yeah.
and so it was a really great classroom for me in forgiveness,
Yeah.
and recognizing that you can take ownership without taking on the guilt that you're this horrible, awful person,
Yeah,
basically,
you forgive yourself. You have to forgive yourself too for things, not just other people. A lot of times people think forgiveness is just about the other person, but it's also looking inward to yourself.
Yeah. I mean, it's like that. There's this, even going back to my car accident, there was this sense for a long time where I realized that I forgive myself for not getting out of that car sooner. I didn't forgive myself for not speaking up, that I held myself to that. And I'm pretty sure that's why the face of the driver turned into me
Yeah.
because I recognize that sure, there was somebody else in the driver's seat, but that could have been the story of my life in a lot of ways, where I was consistently giving away my power because I'd become such a perfectionist about things. And that somehow I had this warped sense that if I gave away my autonomy, if I gave away my decision making to somebody else, then it was on them, the outcome. So that I was protected, basically, that my indecision was actually my sanctuary, which in reality it was my purgatory.
Right.
But I didn't know that. And so it was a really big wake up call for so many different things. And I'd grown up with my mother and my stepfather teaching A Course in Miracles in our house, like as a study group, and I'd never read the book. And I can remember like being in high school and I'd be like, Mom, what do I tell people about these people that come to your house every week? Like, who are these people? And she's like, but she said, dear, you don't have to tell them anything. And she said, say they're my friends and, blah, 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 blah. And I was like, what even is this thing? Go off to these classes and like, you come back. And she's like, well, I just have one question for you. And I said, okay. And she said, how am I as a mother to you? And I said, what do you mean? And she's like, well, compared to how I was maybe like 5 years ago, 6 years ago, or something like that, how do you think I am as your mother? And I really thought about it. And I was like, oh, well, you're really good about listening and you're really patient and you take an interest in everything I'm doing and everything like that. And then now, do you remember what I was like before I started, doing these classes and things like that? And I remembered the emotions. I remembered her falling apart easier. I remembered her, being much more like unstable, basically, too, in a lot of ways. And I hadn't really ever thought about it until that point where I was like, I wonder what shifted. It was like, I just saw my mom kind of growing up, quote unquote, but she never made a big deal about it. She never talked about it. It was like, it was the blue book in the house that was down in the living room. And I knew she had a copy in her room too, but I'd never opened it. And so what's really interesting was, even though I'd been, exposed to the result and the effects of it, that A Course in Miracles is kind of like very unusual for like spiritual thought system. And the fact that it's not about trying to attract other members, quote unquote. It's not a church. It's not a religion. It's not a cult. It's not about trying to have anybody change any part of their life unless they're curious about it. And so, if somebody asks me that, I teach it, then certainly I'll talk to them about it. But do I go and talk to my friends and, say, hey, I'm a Course in Miracles teacher and this is what I do? No, not at all. And so the way that it found me basically was through this journaling that I was talking about after the car accident, where the first thing I wrote, it was called "The Instant Is All There Is." And it was all about the idea that the past is gone and that all there is right now. And it was, I think I can't remember it by heart now, but I should have brought it with me. But it was like, basically that there's nothing you can do to make God love you more, and there's nothing you can do to make him love you less. All is as it is, joined as one, or something like that, right? Now, I'd never read the Course in Miracles, but I'd been a child of parents that were teaching it, but I didn't ever listen to what they were teaching. So I thought that was kind of interesting, because when I showed it to my mother, the first I wrote, and she was like, "You wrote this?" And I said, "Yeah, I did." And she's like, "Well, how did you write this?" And I said, "Well, Mom, I was just in so much pain, and I had this feeling inside of me, kind of like when I was in the car and I heard to put the hand up, that writing would help." And so she was like, "Oh, well, this is very interesting." She said, "Well, just keep doing it and see what happens." So after about, probably 4 or 6 months or something like that, after the car accident, of me writing, and I was writing kind of, it wasn't every day, but it was like probably 3-4 times a week or something. And they were very short. It was like just sit down and I would get this feeling to write. And then I would write it out, and it wasn't in an alternate voice or anything. It was my own voice, but I heard it very clearly. And they were usually pretty short, maybe like I would sit down for 5-10 minutes or something like that. But the thing I found really interesting was that all the grammar was perfect. All the, everything was just written out in flow. And then I would know that it was time to be done. And I would just put my pen down or my pencil, whatever it was, and I would close my little journal and I would go off and do my day. But what I was realizing was that every time I was writing, I was feeling calmer. I was feeling safer. I was feeling more connected to something that was bigger than me. So after I had this for, about 4 to 6 months or something, my mom, every time I would write, I would send her a copy of it and show it to her. And so, she was reading it over and everything. And after a while, she was finally like, I have this friend that I think would it be okay if I showed her your journal? And I was like, okay. And she said, yeah, I think she might just be somebody who also would understand what you're writing. And I think it could be very helpful. And so I thought, okay, sure. So I had her show it to her friend. And it turned out her friend was very good friends with one of the main teachers of A Course in Miracles, Dr. Kenneth Wapnick, who my mom was very connected to too. But I think my mom was kind of, well, I don't want to have it be that she's giving it to him. She thought she'd have somebody else read it first, everything else. And so anyways, it made its way to him. And, I guess he read through what I had written or something like that. And then I remember I was at my mom's kitchen, because I was visiting her up where she lived. And the phone rang, and then she answered it, and she was like, "Oh, Nanci, it's for you." And I was like, okay. And so, I picked up the phone, and it was Ken. And he said, "Oh, is this the famous Nanci?" And I said, "Yes." "Who is this?" And he's, "Oh, I'm Ken, and he's like, "I was reading what you wrote." And he said, "It's very, 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 very beautiful." And he said, "So here's the thing. Don't take it too seriously. Write when you want, and don't read anything else." And he said, "And least of all, don't read anything in A Course in Miracles." And I said, "Okay, no problem. I haven't." So, and he said, "Sometime, yes, I'll tell you that it's, you can read it or whatever." And he said, "And of course, do not take any of this at all." He's like, "This is just my perspective." And for some reason, I just trusted him completely and implicitly. And I knew that he was coming from a place that I wanted to know more about. And so I, kept writing and kept writing and kept writing, just like he had said. And it was never any pressure, never, I could just, I could be like in a class and I put my pen down and go and do something else and come back and write it. And I knew when it was unfinished, and then I knew when it was finished. And, that's all I can kind of say about it. And so I had this whole journal collected. After about a year of doing that and sending everything off to Ken, and I would hear from him. And he told me, he said, "Call me anytime. Anytime you want to call me." right? And I came to find out later that he had people all over the world calling him, like, you know, but he always made time to talk to me, and he would call me back within usually 30 minutes to an hour. He'd call back. And even if it was like just for 30 seconds to talk to me, he would talk to me.
Wow.
And so he was really, and then it was about a year later. And then he said, okay, he said, so today's the day. He said, if you really want to, he said, go ahead and open the blue book. And I said, okay. So I did, and I opened it, and it was like the weirdest thing, because even though there was a difference, there was something that was very similar. And the thing that was very similar was that tone of kindness, was that tone of gentleness, was that tone of non-judgment that I had heard in that car accident that I had been writing in this journal. And so immediately the flow of the words, the like poet kind of sounding to the words and everything like that, there was something so familiar to me. And like I had said before, when I started writing, it was more that I felt like I was accessing a memory than something new. And so it was like this universality of gentleness, of love, of this pure truth, basically. And that I was just tapping into an extension of it. And so after I started reading it on my own, and I was like, wow, this is really beautiful. And also, wow, this really reminds me of what I've been writing. And so I started, you know, doing that for another probably 6 months or so, or something like that, still talking to Ken and still doing my writings and, you know, everything else. And then about 6 months later, he said, well, he said, I'd really like to invite you to come to one of my classes. And he said, I'd love to meet you. But he said, but no pressure. So, you know, if you want to come. If you can't, that's fine too. So I, of course, booked a ticket, and I went down to go see him. And it was the same thing where he had like this class that was, you know, probably, I don't know, 80 people, 100 people or something like that in the classroom in Temecula where he taught. And I walked in, and he ran down the aisle as fast as he could. And he was like, Nanci, oh, the famous Nanci. And he like threw his arms around me and gave me a hug. I was just like, oh, I'm home. Like, you know, I mean, he just had such warmth and love, and he met you where he was, you know, wherever you were. And he certainly embodied kindness on every level. And so, you know, I became, quote unquote, a student, not just of A Course in Miracles, but also like his student. And he definitely became a mentor for me. And then when I moved to Southern California, then I was able to go see him much more often. But until that point, you know, I was kind of going back and forth, maybe like once every 4 months, maybe one of his classes. So that's how A Course in Miracles found me. And then I basically, you know, combined everything I was doing at the same point, where I realized that Pilates, that was healing my shoulder, that part of it was that I had this understanding of the body that I'd never gone to school for, that, you know, didn't really make sense, quote unquote. And I started to ask my Pilates teacher all the time questions about things. And I'd be like, well, I know we did this exercise, and did we do that because we're trying to do this? And she'd be like, yes, exactly. And then she started giving me books and giving me other things. And so after I'd been doing Pilates for, you know, it was probably about 3-4 years. And she was like, you know, I really think you could be a good teacher of this. And I think you would probably love doing the focus like she had done with the rehab. So she forwarded me to her mentor. And so I went off for another journey for that. And, you know, I got certified to teach Pilates. And then I started my own business with that. And so all of this was happening, you know, kind of at the same time. And, you know, in that time I got married, and in that time I got divorced, and in that time I just up in California, and, you know, just so many different things. And I was also trying to get my PhD before I was in that car accident in psychology. And so, but Pilates, because it opened me up so much and all this other stuff was going on, I decided to just get a master's and not get the PhD. So I deferred my enrollment in that. And then I did the studio and got the life coaching certification, but wanted to have it be a spiritual focus, so that there was that element of spirituality brought into, again, people's experience in a very practical way. Because that's what A Course in Miracles really is it's a practical way of living. It's not anything ritualistic. It's not like a checklist. It's, you know, really about, again, how you're being. and that decision for how you're being is always up to you.
Wow. I mean, what an amazing story you have, everything from beginning to end, and how everything just literally like falls in place, like totally falls in place, from the things that you were doing, even the negative experiences that you had in your life that led you to the exact point in time and where you're at. And, you had mentioned trusting that one person, and trusting and letting go of the man who saved, or letting go of the wall for the man who was saving you off the cliff.
Yeah.
It sounds like that was a big theme. And I even want to go back to where you were talking about where you saw your own face, as far as the kindness and the forgiveness and all of that stuff. It's like all of these experiences happen to show you like a mirror, like to see what really needed to be healed in yourself. And I think that's really key here to talk about, is that a lot of times we're so outer focused. And I love talking to you because I can just tell that you're a very inner focused person. And if we are constantly focusing on, they did this to me, or that happened to me, or this and that is going on in my life, and everything's horrible, and this is bad, and that is wrong, and if only this would be different, right? We miss out on what's going on inside of us to bring us that healing. And it's so, so important. And I can see it and hear it in you. I mean, you're so beautiful. You just shine and radiate. But I love listening to you talk about this because it is very inspiring. And I hope that especially my listeners can sense that. And I'm sure that they will, because you've gone from a really, difficult time in your life to now helping other people physically, emotionally, spiritually. And that's what this is all about, right? And whatever people can take away from this to help them move forward to heal is so priority for me. That's why I like bringing different people on who have different perspectives and different attitudes. And I would love to know, what do you feel like would be, I'm not real big on advice, because I feel like advice is difficult, because you just don't know, like if I give you advice based on my filter of the world or my perception of the world, it might not really apply. But as far as generally for healing, what would you say to everybody? Like, what would be a takeaway that you would love people to know?
I would say that the greatest shift, the biggest, transformation that was able to become possible for me was the moment, just like you were talking about, when I recognized that the source of my power was my ability to become the consistency in the chaos, basically. That if I knew who I am, what I am, right? And that I could own that without guilt, without defense, that was actually my safety, that was actually my power, that was my salvation. Because then I can go through whatever seems to happen outside of me that looks so different, that looks so chaotic, that looks so painful, that looks so, troubled. But I'm coming from that place within me that's that calm and that stillness. And that allows me then to go into whatever form of healing is going to be the most helpful for me. And so, and then I get to choose. I mean, we all get to have our preferences, right? But what I really realized was that there's a difference between a preference and having an investment in something. So like if I'm saying that, okay, I heard from so-and-so that ayahuasca was the key to healing, let's say, right? And that then I told myself that was the way that I was going to heal, because that person had gotten so much better, and that, clearly that was going to also be helpful to me because I was intrigued by it or something. And I go and I have the ayahuasca ceremony, let's say, and then I don't have that same result. Now I have yet another reason to show to myself that I'm not enough, that I am defective in some way. Whereas instead, if I say, okay, this is where I am right now, this is where I've been, but I'm here right now. And I'm not going to allow where I've been dictate what I can experience now. I'm not going to deny it, but I'm going to look at it as being a part of my journey rather than apart from it. And then I'm going to then be empowered to be a part of my healing rather apart from it. It's not going to be the ayahuasca or the Pilates or the acupuncture that's going to heal me. It's going to be my willingness to be a part of the healing that's going to heal me. It's going to be my willingness to invite the person that is in front of me and actually see them as the same as me rather than different. And that's very important, I feel like, for anyone that's, quote, a healer, that when you're working with somebody, if you're constantly focusing on seeing them as different than you, then you're going to miss the actual sameness that exists between the two of you, which is that you can always come from a different place with a different interpretation, and that person is there to be your, teacher as much as you are to be theirs. And there's always that place. And so certainly, we live in a world of hierarchy. We live in a world that pays attention to letters after your name. We live in a world that gives credit, right? And I'm not saying to discredit any of that, but I am saying that when you work with somebody that's, quote, a healer, know that you are also offering something to them because they're coming with a willingness to meet you where you are. And that is then reminding them of the difference between you and them. And then if it's possible for one person to have an experience of healing, then it's possible for everyone. And so if you're not operating from that place, then you're actually coming from an exclusive mindset, and healing is inclusive. Healing is about really drawing everyone into that same oneness. And then whatever specific form is going to meet them as the most helpful is going to be able to have that space to come in.
That's such a great, I love that. That's such great wisdom, because you think about basically putting everybody on the same level, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's literally putting everybody on the same level. Nobody's better than anybody else. Yes, maybe you have more experience in this than I do, or I have more experience in that than you do, or something like that. But we're all equal, right? When it comes to the light that's inside of us, who we are as spiritual beings, and coming together, because I believe that we wouldn't be put together if there wasn't some sort of cosmic force working, God, universe, whatever you want to call it. It was supposed to happen like that, right? So all of the people who I work with teach me something about myself. They might not know that they teach me something about myself, but they help me be a better coach. They may help me be a better listener. They may help me be have more empathy. They may create these light bulb moments inside of me. So I think you're absolutely 100% spot on, that especially as survivors, especially as people who've experienced emotional abuse or trauma, is not to discredit yourself, not to discount yourself, and go in with that level of confidence, because we're all trying to do the same thing. We're all trying to be here to help each other, to heal, to up level, to grow. And what a beautiful thing, right? That's so beautiful. I love it.
It is. It gives you that sense that you do matter, that you do have something to offer, that even if the world says that, you've been leveled to your knees, that there's still something within you that can never be touched. It's beyond time and space. It is your essence, and it is your light, and that you get to reflect that in whatever way that you want. And even if it seems dimmed within you, it's still there.
Yeah.
And there are others that will be able to see it more, and there will be others that will be able to remind you. But ultimately, it's within you, and that you're just a reflection of everything else. And so everything you do has a purpose, and that you get to decide what that purpose is. Is it going to be for the purpose of healing, or is it going to be for the purpose of harm? Is it going to be for the purpose of love, or the purpose of fear? Is it going to be for the purpose of forgiveness, or the purpose of resentment? And, ultimately, the more that you can bring that into alignment with yourself, body, mind, spirit, then that's how things become much more effortless. Not easy, but because you're coming from that place of knowing, you're coming from that place of truth. And so now you can navigate all of the world's worldings that just keep going on no matter what. But you come from that place of empowerment, rather than being that victim, rather than being at the effect of things.
Yeah, we need to, what I'm hearing you say is like, we have choices, right? Let's make choices. Let's be intentional about what we're doing. And then, right, it might be a little bit challenging to do that at the beginning because we might not be used to it. It might not, a lot of us are on autopilot, or there are things that just happen repetitively in habits and things. And that's how our brain is. And that's okay. But it's just a matter of being intentional. What are we going to choose today? What attitudes are we going to choose? What words are we going to choose? How are we going to show up in the world? And then moving forward with that, right? That's how you say, like, we become in alignment. And so that's just absolutely amazing. And thank you so much for that. So I want to know also about your book, because you said you're an author. So what's the name of your book?
The book is called Happily Ever Now,
Okay.
Not After Everything Else is Perfect. It is a guide for overcoming the paralysis of perfectionism by instead looking within for that innate guidance.
Wow, that's cool. I haven't read it, but I love to read, so I'm definitely good. Is it on Amazon, or how do I get it?
So it's going to be actually put out this year on Amazon.
Okay, great. Okay,
yeah.
Good. Okay, so you'll let me know. Let me know
yes.
when it's out. Okay, good. So we'll be on the lookout for that. Do you do online Pilates?
I do. So I teach online Pilates. I teach in-person Pilates. I do online classes with meditation and with the life coaching. And I also do in-person coaching as well. And then I also host weekly rooms on the Clubhouse social media app, which is kind of like a drop-in audio chat. And I do weekly Course in Miracles there with another couple of guys. We have a fun group together, Course in Miracles conversations. And we're actually looking at doing a Course in Miracles led podcast too. Great. That should be launching in the next few months here as well.
That's amazing. You're doing so many wonderful things, spreading that ripple effect and light into the world. So I'm so happy to know you. Tell us one thing that not a lot of people know about Nanci.
Oh, well, so I married, divorced, and then remarried my ex-husband.
Really? Oh, so you're married to him now, right?
Yes.
Yes. Oh, well, good. And
that was all about that idea of that the shift came from, finding the consistency within me versus trying to adapt myself to be different versions of myself. And so that was what made everything be different in the relationship, was finding that sameness within me. And then we had our own paths we went off on, we did our own work, and we kept on having these, kismet type of miracle occurrences where we'd be in different parts of the state and we'd somehow been to each other. And there was obviously something still there. And then it just sort of came into alignment. And then the baby that I never thought I could ever have came into our lives. And so now we are parents to a beautiful baby girl.
That's amazing. It's really interesting how, maybe at that one point in your life, it just wasn't the right timing. And then things shifted, things happened. You got really clear on some things internally. Who knows what he was doing and what was going on in him. And now all of a sudden you're back together and have a beautiful child and a happy marriage. That's phenomenal. I'm so happy for you.
Thank you.
Great. All right. So tell everyone where they can find you if they want to get in touch with you on your socials. I'll also include these in the show notes on the podcast, but just let everybody know in case they want to connect.
Sure. So they can find me on Instagram at Happily Ever Living. They can find me on the web at nancireed.com, and Nanci is with an I, so Nanci, reed.com. And they can also find me on Facebook under Nanci Reed Pilates. That is also part of that Happily Ever Living. That's going to be kind of the larger brand that is launching later on this year too.
That's great. Thank you so much for being here and sharing all of your wisdom with us and all of the different healing tools and your journey and your story. I am just absolutely thrilled, and I hope people will reach out to you if they need support or they want to connect with you, learn more about your story. And I just really, really appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much, Allison. This was an absolute pleasure. And I will mention, you can also find me on Clubhouse every Sunday at 10 a.m. Pacific.
Sundays on Clubhouse. I used to be on Clubhouse, but I sort of rated off.
Yeah, I know the Course in Miracles club that they have there is the only reason that I'm still there, because I've gotten to be connected with these incredible souls. Yeah. But otherwise, don't really spend too much time on there.
Yeah. Well, similar to like podcast format, except for it's live. So maybe once the podcast comes out, it might change that a little bit. But again, thank you so much, and I will definitely connect with you over on Instagram.
Sounds great. Thank you, Allison.
Thank you for being here with me today in the Emotional Abuse Recovery Podcast. I hope you found value here with me. If this podcast episode was helpful to you, I'd love for you to hit subscribe and leave me a review. My goal is to help you go from feeling stuck to set free. You can find me on Instagram and Facebook, and you can check out whentearsleavescars.com for more resources and information to help you with your own emotional abuse recovery. Until next time, here's to believing in